On a scorching summer day in 1885, Sarah Fleming sat rigid in her train seat, the crumpled telegram burning a hole in her reticule. She'd read it so many times over the past 3 days that the words had become seared into her memory. Circumstances. Change, stop. Family concerns regarding height, stop. Advise, canceling journey, stop. Regret, stop. The countryside beyond the window blurred past, each mile taking her further from her Boston life and closer to what should have been her wedding day. She smoothed her traveling skirts, her best navy blue wool, now wrinkled from days of sitting, and touched the simple cameo at her throat. At 5'1", she'd chosen it carefully, wanting to appear dignified rather than desperate. "More tea, miss?" The porter's kind face appeared at her elbow, but Sarah shook her head. Her stomach hadn't held anything but weak tea since the telegram arrived in Chicago, intercepting her journey west. "Too short," she whispered to her reflection in the window glass, as if her height were the measure of her heart's worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The other passengers had changed several times since Boston, but she'd remained, watching stations appear and disappear, each one bringing her closer to Clearwater. She should have turned back in Chicago or Omaha or any of the dozen stops where she could have admitted defeat and returned to her quiet life teaching at Miss Prendergast's school for young ladies. But something in her, perhaps pride, perhaps hope, perhaps sheer stubbornness, had kept her on this westward path. The same something that had made her answer Herbert's advertisement in the Matrimonial Times 6 months ago. Established businessman seeks educated lady companion, height immaterial, character essential. Their letters had been everything she'd dreamed of. Intelligent discourse about books, shared views on education, gentle hints of affection growing between the lines. Herbert had seemed so different from the Boston men who dismissed her as a shelf-worn spinster, too focused on books and teaching to catch a husband in her youth. Next stop, Clearwater Station. The conductor's voice carried through the car, startling Sarah from her reverie. She gathered her small valise. She'd sent her trunk ahead, another humiliation awaiting her, and straightened her hat with trembling fingers. The telegram seemed to mock her from its place in her reticule. Family concerns. Regarding height, Herbert's widowed mother and unmarried sisters had taken one look at the height notation in the marriage license application and decided their 6'2" brother needed someone more suitable, someone taller, someone who wouldn't make him stoop to kiss her. The train's whistle pierced the afternoon air as they approached Clearwater. Sarah caught glimpses of the town through the window, a church steeple, a general store, scattered houses pushing back against the vast Wyoming prairie. This was to have been her home. These streets she would have walked as Mrs. Herbert Crawford. Instead, she would step onto that platform a fool, a middle-aged woman who dared to dream of love, only to be found wanting. The trunk, with her wedding dress and household linens, would stand as testament to her humiliation until she could arrange its return shipment east. The train shuddered to a stop, steam hissing like a chorus of whispers. Sarah remained seated as other passengers gathered their belongings and moved toward the exits. Through the window, she could see families reuniting, travelers dispersing, life continuing as if her world hadn't just shattered. Finally, when the car was nearly empty, she stood, her legs feeling wooden, unwilling to carry her into this new reality. The porter appeared again, concern evident in his dark eyes. "You need help with that bag, miss." Sarah clutched the valise. "No, thank you. I can manage." Just as she'd always managed. Alone. The platform boards creaked beneath her feet as she descended the train steps. The afternoon sun was fierce, nothing like the gentle Boston summers she knew. A bead of perspiration traced down her neck, but she refused to dab at it. Ladies don't sweat, Miss Prendergast always said. Ladies, persevere. The station master approached, his face kind but uncomfortable. Miss Fleming, Mr. Crawford asked me to. That is, there's a message. I've received it. Thank you. Sarah cut him off, her voice steady despite the burning in her throat. She couldn't bear another expression of pity, another reminder of her foolishness. She made her way to a bench in the station's shade, setting her valise beside her like a faithful dog. Her wedding dress waited in that trunk somewhere in the station's storage room, wrapped in tissue paper and dreams that had proven as insubstantial as morning mist. The telegram crackled as she shifted, its presence as impossible to ignore as the hollow ache in her chest. To think that such a small piece of paper could weigh so much, could carry enough words to sink a heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James McKinnon's wagon rattled to a stop outside the Clearwater station just as the afternoon train whistled its departure. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing past Mary's locket to touch the worn leather of his Bible. The small book had been his constant companion these past 3 years, its pages dog-eared with grief and solace alike. The station platform was clearing quickly, folks hurrying to escape the August heat. All except one figure, a woman, in a navy traveling dress, sitting straight-backed on a bench in the shadows. Something about her stillness caught his eye. She wasn't waiting for someone. She had the look of someone who knew nobody was coming. "Afternoon, James," called Station Master Peterson, wiping his brow with a bandana. "Supply list for Thompson's." "Store, James replied, but his eyes kept drifting to the woman. She held herself with dignity despite the defeat evident in her shoulders, a familiar sort of defeat. He saw it in his own mirror often enough. Shame about the Crawford situation. Peterson muttered, following James's gaze. Whole town's been talking about it. Lady came all the way from Boston to marry Herbert Crawford, only to have him cry off because she's too short. His mother's doing, if you ask me. That woman could freeze hell twice over. James's hand tightened on his Bible. He knew what it was. To have love stolen away, though his thief had been fever rather than human cruelty. She's just sitting there. Train doesn't come through until Thursday. She's got nowhere to go, poor soul. I offered to send my boy to the boarding house, but she refused. Proud type. James watched as the woman, Miss Fleming, he presumed, took something from her reticule, a telegram by the look of it. Her fingers smoothed it with the same careful attention he gave to Mary's letters, now pressed between his Bible's pages. Has she eaten? The question surprised him as much as Peterson. Refused anything but tea since she arrived this morning. Reminds me of you after Mary, that same quiet way of bearing up. James nodded slowly, his free hand moving to touch the locket in his pocket. Mary had always said God worked in mysterious ways. She'd read it from this very Bible during those last fever-racked nights. Remember Job, she'd whispered. After all his suffering, God gave him double for his troubles. He found himself walking toward the bench before he'd made any conscious decision. His boots on the wooden planks must have alerted her. She looked up, revealing eyes the color of summer sage, reddened but dry. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "James McKinnon, I wonder if you might help me with something." Those sage-green eyes widened slightly at his approach, but her voice was steady. "How might I be of assistance, Mr. McKinnon?" He pulled the Bible from his pocket, its leather smooth from years of handling. "There's a passage my late wife was fond of, about new beginnings. I've been trying to find it all morning, but my reading's not what it should be. It was a lie." He knew every word in that book by heart, but something in him needed to reach out to this woman who carried herself with such wounded grace. "I'm a teacher by profession," she said, a hint of warmth touching her voice. "I'd be happy to help you search." "Sarah Fleming?" she added after a moment, offering her hand. He took it gently, noting the strength in her grip despite its delicacy. As she opened the Bible, several pressed flowers fell from between its pages, Mary's bookmarks. Miss Fleming caught them before they could blow away, handling them with instinctive care. "Indian paintbrush," she said softly. "We don't have these in Boston." My wife loved them, said they were God's way of painting the prairie. James settled beside her on the bench, careful to leave proper space between them. She pressed one for every spring we had together. Miss Fleming's fingers trembled slightly as she returned the flowers to their resting place. "How long has she been gone?" 3 years this October. Fever. "I'm sorry," she said, and he could hear she meant it, not the hollow sympathy of townsfolk who'd never known real loss, but the understanding of someone who knew how grief could hollow out a heart. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the Bible open between them. Around them, the station's usual afternoon bustle continued, but somehow their bench seemed to exist in a world apart. "My mother always said, God saves his greatest surprises for those who think their story's already written," Miss Fleming said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps she was right. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps she was—" The station clock ticked steadily above them, its hands marking 3C. Sarah had been reading from James's Bible for nearly an hour, her clear voice bringing new life to familiar verses. Neither had mentioned the telegram lying forgotten on the bench beside them. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord," she read, her Boston accent giving the words a refined cadence. "Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Her voice caught slightly on the word future. James watched her profile against the afternoon light. She'd removed her hat while reading, revealing strands of honey-brown hair touched with sunset gold at the temples. Unlike the women of Clearwater who battled the Wyoming elements with practical simplicity, Sarah Fleming wore her femininity with natural grace, each delicate movement telling stories of Eastern refinement and quiet strength. The station clock chimed the quarter hour, startling them both. James suddenly remembered his supply list, the waiting wagon, the wolves that would be prowling by dusk, yet he couldn't bear the thought of leaving her here alone. "Miss Fleming," he said, then paused, searching for the right words. His large, work-roughened hands looked almost comical, holding the delicate Bible pages. "Sarah," she corrected with a small smile. "After sharing scripture and pressed flowers, I believe we've moved past formalities, Mr. McKinnon." "James," he offered in return, his voice low and rumbling like distant summer thunder. "Truth is, I find myself troubled by your predicament." Sarah closed the Bible gently, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. "You needn't concern yourself. I've weathered disappointments before." "No doubt." James shifted on the bench, his tall frame making the wooden slats creak. "But alone at a train station with nowhere to go ain't just a disappointment. It's a problem needing solving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Sarah's spine straightened even further, if that were possible. "I don't require rescue, sir. The eastbound train arrives Thursday, and I'll simply— 3 days sitting on this bench?" James shook his head, the movement slow and deliberate. "Begging your pardon, but that won't do." A flicker of something, pride perhaps, or well-concealed panic, crossed Sarah's face. "I assure you I've faced greater hardships than a wooden bench." James studied her for a long moment. The high color in her cheeks told him what her words wouldn't. That despite her brave face, Sarah Fleming was a woman adrift, her carefully laid plans scattered like chaff in the Wyoming wind. "Miss Sarah," he said carefully, "I've a proposition that might sound peculiar given our short acquaintance." She tensed visibly, and he hurried to clarify. "Nothing improper. It's just, I've a ranch 10 miles west. Plenty of room. My foreman's. Mother Mrs. Wilson comes by most days. Would be no impropriety in you staying until Thursday's train." Sarah's fingers worried at the cameo at her throat. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose—" "Not imposition when there's mutual benefit," James interrupted, surprising himself with his persistence. "Truth is, the place could use a woman's touch if only for a few days, and—" He hesitated, then finished honestly, "It's powerful lonely sometimes." The admission hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. The station clock ticked. 5 times before Sarah spoke. "You're a stranger, Mr. McKinnon, James." Her voice was soft but firm. "Yet in the hour we've spent together, I sense you're an honorable man. Your wife would be proud of your kindness to a stranded traveler." James felt Mary's locket warm against his chest, as if in agreement. "Still," Sarah continued, "I must consider my reputation. I've been a teacher for 20 years. Such positions require unimpeachable character." James nodded solemnly. "Understand completely. That's why I mentioned Mrs. Wilson. She's a proper dragon when it comes to propriety. Town respects her judgment. If she's overseeing your stay, not a soul would whisper. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sarah's sage green eyes searched his face, looking for deception or ulterior motives. Finding none, she glanced at the telegram beside her, then at the darkening sky. The afternoon was waning, and with it, her options. "Very well," she said with quiet dignity. "I accept your hospitality until Thursday, Mr. McKinnon, but I insist on earning my keep." James stood, offering his hand. Never doubted it for a moment. School teachers aren't known for idleness. A genuine smile touched Sarah's lips as she placed her small hand in his. The contrast was striking, her pale, delicate fingers nearly disappearing in his sun-browned, calloused palm. Yet there was nothing fragile about the way she gripped his hand, using it to steady herself as she rose from the bench. "I should inform the station master," she said, gathering her valise. "Peterson already knows," James said, with a gesture toward the office window, where the station master quickly pretended he hadn't been watching their exchange. "Man's nosier than a fox in a henhouse." The comment startled a laugh from Sarah, a melodic sound that made James realize how long it had been since he'd heard genuine female laughter. "Not since Mary—" "Well then," Sarah said, settling her hat back on her head with practiced precision. "I suppose we're off to see this ranch of yours." James nodded, suddenly aware of what he'd just done. He'd invited a stranger, a cultured Boston lady, no less, to his run-down ranch with its leaking roof and weathered fences. Mary would have been mortified by the state of the place. But as they walked toward his wagon, Sarah's steps light, but determined beside his longer stride. He couldn't bring himself to regret the impulse. Something about this tiny woman with her straight spine and wounded dignity called to the protective instinct he'd thought died with Mary. The wagon wheel wobbled slightly as he helped her up to the seat. Her skirts rustled against the rough wood, as she arranged herself with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to farm vehicles. "Been meaning to fix that wheel," he said, oddly embarrassed by the wagon's poor condition. "No need for apologies," Sarah replied. "I may be from Boston, but I assure you I won't shatter at the first bump in the road." James looked at her, really looked at her, and saw beneath the proper exterior to the resilience beneath. 5'1" of pure determination, this woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles for love, only to be rejected for her height. "No, ma'am," he said as he climbed up beside her. "I don't reckon you would." As the wagon pulled away from Clearwater Station, Neither James nor Sarah noticed Station Master Peterson hurrying to the telegraph office, news of the unlikely pair burning a hole in his gossip-loving heart. The journey to McKinnon Ranch unfolded across 10 miles of Wyoming vastness, each rotation of the wagon wheels carrying Sarah further from her shattered dreams and into unknown territory. The afternoon sun hung low now, painting the prairie in strokes of amber and gold that took her breath away despite her troubled heart. "It's magnificent," she murmured, forgetting herself for a moment. "Like an ocean of grass." James glanced at her, surprised by the poetry in her observation. Most Easterners just see emptiness. "Then they're not really looking," Sarah replied, her eyes drinking in the rolling landscape. "There's such vastness. Makes a person's trouble seem smaller somehow." A comfortable silence settled between them as the wagon rumbled onward. Sarah noticed how James sat tall in the driver's seat, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the sky. At least 6'4", she guessed, even taller than Herbert Crawford. The thought brought a fresh wave of humiliation, and she turned her face away, pretending to study a distant rock formation. "Might look empty," James said suddenly, breaking into her thoughts. "But it ain't. Prairie's full of life if you know where to look." He pointed with his chin toward a distant movement. "Pronghorn there. Fastest animal in these parts." Sarah squinted, making out the graceful shapes bounding across the grassland. "They're beautiful." "Survivors?" James corrected. "Winter storms, summer drought, wolves, they endure it all." He gave her a sidelong glance. "Remind me of someone I just met." The unexpected compliment warmed her more than it should have. "I hardly think that wheel's getting worse," James interrupted, his attention drawn to the increasingly pronounced wobble. "Been meaning to replace it for months now." He sighed, a sound of resignation familiar to Sarah, the sigh of someone constantly battling circumstance with too few resources. "Perhaps I could help with your accounts while I'm here," she offered without thinking. "I kept the books at Miss Prendergast's for years." James's eyebrows rose. "You offering your services as a bookkeeper, Miss Fleming?" "Sarah," she reminded him, then shrugged slightly. "It seems only fair, given your kindness. Besides," she added with a small smile, "idle hands make for a restless spirit, as my mother used to say." The wagon crested a gentle rise, and there, below them, spread McKinnon Ranch, a modest homestead nestled against rising foothills, sheltered from the worst of the prairie winds. Even from a distance, Sarah could see both its potential and its problems. Sturdy foundations with weathered exteriors, fences that stood straight in some sections while sagging in others, fields showing patches of green amid the drought-stressed landscape. "It's not much," James said, echoing her assessment. "Been hard keeping up since Mary passed." "It's a home," Sarah said quietly. "That's nothing to apologize for." As they approached, a young man emerged from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back on his head. He watched their approach with undisguised curiosity. "That's Tommy Wilson," James explained. "My foreman, though boy of all. Work might be more accurate, good lad. His mother's the woman I mentioned, comes by most days to help with cooking." Tommy met them as James pulled the wagon to a stop, his youthful face open with surprise, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "Mr. McKinnon, didn't expect you back so—" His words faltered as he spotted Sarah, and he hastily removed his hat. "Ma'am, Tommy, this is Miss Sarah Fleming," James said, jumping down from the wagon. "She'll be staying with us until Thursday's train. Miss Fleming, Tommy Wilson." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Wilson," Sarah said with genuine warmth. Tommy's face split into a grin. "Just Tommy, ma'am. Nobody's ever called me Mr. before." He glanced at James with newfound respect. "You bringing a proper lady home, Mr. McKinnon?" James shot him a warning look as he helped Sarah down from the wagon. "Miss Fleming had some trouble with her planned accommodations in town. She'll be our guest for a few days." Tommy's expression sobered with understanding. The Crawford situation? Whole town's talking about it. Shameful, if you ask me, rejecting someone after they've traveled so far. He colored slightly, realizing he might have stepped over a line. Begging your pardon, ma'am. No pardon needed. For honesty, Sarah assured him, finding herself warming to the earnest young man, though I would prefer if we could consider the matter closed. Yes, ma'am, Tommy agreed quickly. Ma's inside. Started supper when she saw the wagon coming up the road. As if summoned by her son's words, a stout woman appeared in the doorway of the ranch house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her grey streaked. Hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and her sharp eyes missed nothing as they assessed Sarah from hat to boots. Margaret Wilson, James said, guiding Sarah forward. My neighbour and the closest thing to civilization this ranch has seen. In 3 years, Mrs. Wilson, this is Miss Sarah Fleming. The Boston teacher, Mrs. Wilson stated, her tone making it clear Peterson's telegraph had done its work. Heard you've had a rough welcome to Wyoming, Miss Fleming. Sarah straightened her spine, preparing for judgment or pity. She found neither. In the older woman's frank gaze, only practical assessment and a hint of approval. Life rarely follows our careful plans, Mrs. Wilson, Sarah replied, but I'm learning that unexpected detours can bring unexpected kindness. Mrs. Wilson's weathered face softened. Well said. She stepped back from the doorway. Supper's nearly ready. You'll want to freshen up first, I expect. Been a long journey. The simple acknowledgement of her fatigue, both physical and emotional, nearly undid Sarah's composure. She blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that had threatened all day. Thank you, she managed. That would be most welcome. James cleared his throat. Tommy, see to the horses. Mrs. Wilson, if you could show Miss Fleming to Mary's, to the spare room, already changed the linens, Mrs. Wilson assured him, taking Sarah's valise despite her protests. Come along, Miss Fleming, let's get you settled. As Sarah followed Mrs. Wilson into the ranch house, she felt James's eyes on her back, watchful, concerned, and perhaps a bit bewildered by his own impulsive invitation. She understood the feeling perfectly. Just hours ago, she'd been a bride-to-be, her future mapped out with Eastern precision. Now, she was stepping into a stranger's home, following a woman she'd just met into a room that had once belonged to another. The detour in her carefully planned journey couldn't have been more complete. Yet as she crossed the threshold of McKinnon Ranch, Sarah felt something unexpected stir within her. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its quiet precursor. Possibility. Behind her, she heard James speak quietly to Tommy. Send word to your cousins in the north pasture. Tell them to keep an eye out for wolves tonight. They've been getting bolder lately. Even in this moment of domestic transition, Sarah realized, the dangers of frontier life continued their steady encroachment. This was no Boston drawing room, with its predictable rhythms. Here, survival required constant vigilance against weather, predators, and the wilderness itself. Perhaps, she thought as she followed Mrs. Wilson down a narrow hallway, that was why rejection had cut so deeply. In a place where genuine threats lurked at every turn, to be found wanting for something as inconsequential as height seemed particularly cruel. Here we are, Mrs. Wilson announced, opening a door to reveal a simple but clean bedroom. It's not fancy, but it's private. Sarah stepped inside, taking in the patchwork quilt on the narrow bed, the worn rag rug on the plank floor, the small window that looked out toward distant mountains now gilded by the setting sun. It's lovely, she said, truthfully. Mrs. Wilson set the valise down and gave Sarah a long, measuring look. You're nothing like what we expected, Miss Fleming. Sarah smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirt, suddenly self-conscious. Oh, after what happened in town, well, most women would be sobbing in a boarding house by now, or on the first train east. Perhaps I simply haven't had time to collapse properly, Sarah offered with a wry smile. Mrs. Wilson chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. I don't think that's it at all. She moved to the door, then paused. James McKinnon is a good man who's known more than his share of sorrow. Whatever your plans may be, Miss Fleming, I hope you'll be gentle with him. Before Sarah could formulate a response to this unexpected statement, Mrs. Wilson was gone, leaving her alone with the lingering scent of lavender from the freshly laundered sheets and the growing realization that she had stumbled into something far more complicated than temporary lodging. Outside her window, the vast Wyoming sky was turning from gold to deepest blue, stars emerging like scattered diamonds across its darkening canvas. So different from Boston's narrow slice of heaven, hemmed in by buildings and gas lamps that dimmed the night's glory. "So this is West," Sarah whispered to herself, pressing a hand against the cool glass, big enough to make a person feel small, yet somehow freer. The irony wasn't lost on her. Rejected for being too small, she'd found herself in a place vast enough to accommodate any size of dream or heartbreak. Supper at McKinnon Ranch proved to be a revelation. Sarah had expected frontier simplicity, beans and hardtack perhaps, but Mrs. Wilson had somehow conjured a hearty stew, thick with vegetables and beef, cornbread that steamed when broken open, and preserved peaches that tasted of sunshine. "This is wonderful," Sarah said after her first bite, genuine appreciation warming her voice. She'd changed into her second-best dress, a practical grey with subtle blue piping, and pinned her hair back into a neat chignon. Simple preparations, but they had restored a measure of her dignity. "Just honest food," Mrs. Wilson replied, though pleasure flickered across her weathered features. "Nothing fancy." "Fancier than what we usually get," Tommy said, earning a sharp look from James that quieted him immediately. James himself sat at the head of the rough-hewn oak table, his large frame dwarfing the sturdy chair. He'd cleaned up. As well, Sarah noticed, his dark beard freshly trimmed, his hair still damp from washing. The transformation wasn't dramatic, yet it spoke volumes about his respect for her presence. "Miss Fleming was a teacher in Boston," James said, breaking a somewhat awkward silence. "At a school for young ladies." "A real teacher?" Tommy's eyes widened with interest. "With actual books and such?" Sarah smiled at his enthusiasm. "Yes, Mr. Wilson. Literature, mathematics, penmanship, and proper deportment, though I confess the latter was always my weakest subject." "Could have fooled me," Mrs. Wilson muttered approvingly. "You sit straighter than a church pew." "Miss Prendergast insisted," Sarah explained. She believed a teacher's posture reflected her moral character. She demonstrated the exaggerated straight spine her employer had demanded, then relaxed with a small laugh. 20 years of such training becomes habit. 20 years teaching, Mrs. Wilson mused, must be rewarding work. It is. Sarah's eyes softened with genuine fondness. There's nothing quite like watching a young mind blossom when presented with new ideas. Even the most reluctant student can surprise you when given the right encouragement. James studied her over his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. "No schools out here," he said. "Not for 50 miles at least. Children learn from their parents, if they learn at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Surely that can't be right," Sarah said, genuinely disturbed by the notion. "Education is essential for city folk, maybe," Tommy interjected. "Out here, knowing how to read weather signs and track game matters more than reading books?" "Both matter," Sarah replied firmly. "The practical and the intellectual shouldn't be enemies, Mr. Wilson. They should be partners in creating a full life." A charged silence followed her words. James's eyes met hers across the table, something like respect kindling in their blue depths. "Well said," he finally murmured. "Mary used to argue the same." The mention of his late wife cast a momentary shadow over the table. Sarah glanced at Mrs. Wilson, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. "How long will you be staying, Miss Fleming?" Tommy asked, breaking the tension. "Until Thursday's train," she replied, the reminder of her temporary status unexpectedly stinging. "Merely a brief detour in my journey." "Back to Boston?" Mrs. Wilson asked, serving more stew. Sarah hesitated. She hadn't allowed herself to think beyond Thursday, beyond the humiliation of returning east with her dreams in tatters. "I haven't decided." "Well," Mrs. Wilson said briskly, "while you're deciding, perhaps you could cast an eye over James's accounts. Man can run a ranch, but couldn't balance a ledger if his life depended on it." "Margaret," James protested, "but without heat." "Am I wrong?" Mrs. Wilson challenged, hands on her hips. "No," he admitted reluctantly. "Figures were always Mary's province." "I'd be happy to help," Sarah offered, "though I wouldn't want to intrude on private matters." James waved away her concern. "Nothing private about my financial troubles. Whole town likely knows more about my debts than I do." The frank admission surprised her. Herbert Crawford had guarded his business affairs jealously, even from his fiancée. This openness, this lack of pretense, was refreshingly direct. "Then it's settled," Mrs. Wilson announced, gathering empty plates. "Tommy, help me clear up. James, show Miss Fleming to the study. Those accounts won't untangle themselves." The older woman's authoritative tone brooked no argument. Sarah found herself rising automatically, responding to the familiar cadence of a woman who, like Miss Prendergast, expected immediate compliance. James led her down a short hallway to a small room lined with bookshelves. A roll-top desk dominated one corner, its surface buried under a chaotic sprawl of papers, receipts, and leather-bound ledgers. A single oil lamp cast a warm glow over the comfortable disarray. "Mary's domain," James explained, gesturing to the desk. "I haven't had the heart to properly sort it since she passed." Sarah stepped into the room, immediately drawn to the bookshelves. They held an unexpected treasure. Volumes of Dickens alongside practical manuals on animal husbandry. Poetry collections shelved next to guides to Wyoming flora. "Your wife had eclectic tastes," she observed, running a finger along the spines. Mary believed in feeding both parts of herself, the practical rancher's wife and the dreamer who came west seeking adventure. James moved to the desk, self-consciously, attempting to create order from chaos. Said books were cheaper than train tickets when you needed to escape. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah smiled, warming to this woman she would never meet. "She sounds remarkable." She was. James's voice held no bitterness, only a gentle melancholy. "Think you might have liked each other." The simple statement touched Sarah deeply. That he could imagine her and his beloved wife as friends spoke of his healing. Incomplete. Perhaps, but genuine. "The accounts," she prompted gently, sensing his discomfort with emotional territories. "Right." James pulled out the desk chair for her. "It's a proper mess, I'm afraid. Been meaning to sort it, but there are always fences to mend and cattle to tend," Sarah finished, settling herself at the desk. "I understand, Mr. McKinnon." "James," he reminded her, hovering uncertainly. "James," she agreed, already organizing papers into neat stacks. "This may take some time." He nodded, clearly relieved to have the matter in capable hands. "I'll be on the porch if you need anything. Got some harness mending to do before dark." Left alone in the study, Sarah took a deep breath, inhaling the comforting scent of paper and leather bindings. This room felt lived in, loved, a sanctuary of sorts. Mary McKinnon's presence lingered here in the carefully chosen books, in the pressed flower bookmarks similar to those in James's Bible, in the feminine touches that softened the masculine. practicality of the space. Sarah opened the most recent ledger, her trained eye quickly identifying the problem. James had dutifully recorded expenses and income, but without any system or organization. Cattle sales were jumbled with household purchases, feed costs mixed with equipment repairs. "Oh my," she murmured, reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. "No wonder you're struggling, James McKinnon." For the next 2 hours, Sarah lost herself in the familiar comfort of numbers and order. Here was a language she understood perfectly: debits and credits, assets and liabilities. As she worked, a picture of McKinnon Ranch emerged through its finances, a once prosperous operation slowly declining after Mary's death, not through mismanagement, but through grief's inattention to detail. The ranch wasn't failing, she realized with growing excitement. It was merely rudderless. Through the open window came the rhythmic sound of James working on the porch, the creak of his rocking chair, the soft grunt as he pulled leather through tough harness rings, the occasional murmured direction to a dog she hadn't yet met. Comforting sounds, steady and sure, like the man himself. When Mrs. Wilson appeared with a cup of tea, Sarah looked up in surprise, unaware of how much time had passed. "Making sense of it?" the older woman asked, nodding toward the organized piles. "Perfect sense," Sarah confirmed. "The ranch is actually in decent shape, financially speaking. It's simply a matter of organization and planning." Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Is that so? James was convinced he'd be bankrupt by winter. Not if he follows the system I'm creating." Sarah showed her the freshly drawn ledger pages. "See here, monthly expenses clearly separated from seasonal ones, income tracked by source, reserves set aside for emergencies." Mrs. Wilson studied the neat columns with obvious approval. "You've got a gift, Miss Fleming." "Just training and experience," Sarah demurred. "Nothing special." "Humph." Mrs. Wilson set the teacup down firmly. "False modesty doesn't become you. Own your talents, girl. God gave them to you for a reason." The blunt assessment, so unlike the genteel criticism Sarah was accustomed to, startled a laugh from her. "Mrs. Wilson, you would have made Miss Prendergast faint with such directness." "Good thing I'm not in Boston, then." Mrs. Wilson smiled, a surprisingly impish expression on her serious face. "Drink your tea before it cools, and don't work all night. We rise early here." After the older woman left, Sarah sipped her tea and gazed out the window at the darkening prairie. Stars were emerging in a sky vaster than any she'd ever seen, a celestial canopy unmarred by city smoke or tall buildings. She thought of her trunk at the Clearwater station, of the wedding dress packed so carefully with all her hopes and dreams. Just that morning, she'd believed her future lay in becoming Mrs. Herbert Crawford. Now, as evening settled over McKinnon Ranch, that future seemed as distant and unreal as Boston itself. Outside on the porch, James had lit a lantern that cast his elongated shadow across the yard. His silhouette looked like something from mythology, a giant hewn from darkness and light, solid as the mountains behind him. A stark contrast to Herbert Crawford's carefully cultivated urbanity. "Such different men," she whispered to herself, surprised by the comparison, "as different as the worlds they inhabit." The thought was still lingering in her mind when she finally closed the ledger and made her way to bed. In the small room that had once been Mary's, Sarah lay beneath the patchwork quilt, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of prairie night. Coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through grass, the occasional lowing of cattle in their pens. She should have felt utterly displaced, adrift in this alien landscape. Instead, as sleep claimed her, Sarah experienced a curious sensation, not quite belonging, but perhaps its first tentative seedling. The feeling that she had, against all odds, found herself exactly where she needed to be. Dawn arrived with startling brilliance, flooding Sarah's small room with golden light before she was fully ready to greet the day. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place herself. The unfamiliar bed, the rough-hewn ceiling beams, the distant, Sounds of livestock instead of Boston's morning traffic. Then memory returned. The telegram, the station, James McKinnon's unexpected kindness. Sarah rose and dressed efficiently, choosing her most practical gown, a navy cotton with minimal bustle, suitable for household work. After pinning her hair in a simple style, she made her way toward the kitchen, following the aroma of fresh coffee and frying bacon. To her surprise, James was already seated at the table, studying the reorganized account book she'd left on the desk last night. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," Sarah offered, suddenly self-conscious. In the harsh light of day, her presence in his home seemed presumptuous, her work on his accounts an intrusion. "You did all this last night?" he asked without preamble, gesturing to the ledger. "I hope I haven't overstepped." "Overstepped?" James stood, his height even more imposing in the small kitchen. "Miss Fleming, Sarah, according to these figures, I'm not nearly as close to ruin as I thought." Relief loosened the tension in her shoulders. "No, you're not. Your ranch is actually quite solvent. It simply needed proper accounting." 3 years I've been worrying myself sick," he said, shaking his head in wonder. 3 years thinking I'd lose Mary's dream to the bank. "The drought hasn't helped," Sarah acknowledged, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "But with careful planning, you should weather it quite well." James studied her with new eyes, not just politeness toward a stranded traveler, but genuine respect. "Where did you learn such skills?" "My father was an accountant," Sarah explained, warming her hands on the coffee cup. "He believed his daughters should understand finances as well as his sons. Miss Prendergast later found my abilities useful for the school's books." "Lucky for me," James said quietly. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only when Mrs. Wilson bustled in from outside, her arms full of fresh eggs. "You're up early, Miss Fleming," she observed. "Sleep well?" "Remarkably so," Sarah admitted, surprised by the truth of it. Despite the strange surroundings and tumultuous emotions, she'd slept more soundly than she had in weeks. Something about the prairie air, perhaps. "It's the quiet," Mrs. Wilson said knowingly. "Boston never truly sleeps, I'd wager. Here, night means something." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what the older woman meant. The profound silence of the Wyoming night had been almost a presence itself, vast, comforting, primordial. "I've eggs to gather and butter to churn before breakfast," Mrs. Wilson continued briskly. "James, don't you have fence mending in the north pasture today?" "Tommy's seeing to it," he replied, still focused on the ledger. "Thought I might show Sarah around the ranch if she's interested." The casual invitation hung in the air. Both women turned to him with similarly surprised expressions, though for different reasons, Sarah suspected. "I'd like that very much," she said before Mrs. Wilson could object to the impropriety. One day of scandal wouldn't significantly worsen her already compromised reputation. "After breakfast, then." James nodded, as if the matter were settled. Weather's holding fair. Mrs. Wilson made a small harumphing sound, but offered no direct objection. Instead, she handed Sarah an apron. "Make yourself useful while I'm outside, if you're so inclined. Biscuit dough needs kneading." The familiar domestic task welcomed Sarah back to herself. As she worked the dough with practiced movements, she found her thoughts settling into unexpected clarity. Yesterday's heartbreak remained, but it no longer consumed her. In its place grew something tentative yet sturdy, not quite peace, but perhaps its precursor. James watched her from his seat. At the table, his gaze a tangible weight, not unpleasant, merely present, different from Herbert Crawford's assessing eyes, which had always seemed to be measuring her against some invisible standard she could never quite discern. "Your ranch," she ventured, needing to break the silence. "How long has it been in your family?" "It hasn't," he replied, folding the ledger closed. "Built it from nothing 10 years ago. Mary and I came west from Pennsylvania after the war. I'd had enough of crowds and noise." Sarah nodded, understanding completely after just one night of prairie silence. It must have been difficult at first. Nearly killed us that first winter, he admitted with surprising candor. But Mary never complained, not once, said hardship was just the price of dreams worth having. The sentiment resonated deeply with Sarah. Hadn't she risked everything on her own dream, traveling 2,000 miles for a chance at happiness? She sounds very wise, she said softly. She was. James's voice held no awkwardness now when speaking of his late wife, just genuine reverence touched with lingering affection. Think that's why she'd approve of you being here. Mary couldn't abide waste, especially of courage. The unexpected compliment warmed Sarah more than it should have. Before she could formulate a response, Tommy burst through the door, his young face alight with excitement. "Mr. McKinnon, one of the mares is foaling, and it looks to be a difficult birth." James was on his feet instantly, all trace of the contemplative man vanishing beneath the rancher's urgent focus. "Where?" "North Stable. Jackson's with her. But he sent me running for you." James paused only long enough to glance at Sarah. "Our tour will have to wait." "Of course," she said quickly. "Is there anything I can do to help?" The question seemed to surprise him. "It's messy work, not suited for—" "I assisted our cook's mare once when I was 16, Sarah interrupted. "Father said I had steady hands." James and Tommy exchanged startled looks. Clearly, Boston school teachers weren't expected to have experience with livestock birthing. "Could use all the help we can get," James finally decided. "Tommy, tell Mrs. Wilson where we've gone." The North Stable smelled of hay, horse, and the unmistakable tang of animal distress. A dappled grey mare lay on her side in a stall padded with fresh straw, her sides heaving with exertion. A weather-beaten man who had to be Jackson knelt beside, her head murmuring soothing words in a surprisingly gentle voice. "Foal's turned wrong," he reported without preamble as James and Sarah approached. "Can't get it repositioned by myself." Sarah didn't wait for instruction. Removing her apron, she rolled up her sleeves and knelt in the straw beside the laboring animal. "What do you need me to do?" Again, that flash of surprise in James's eyes, quickly replaced by grateful acceptance. "Hold her head. Keep her calm while Jackson and I try to turn the foal." For the next hour, the three adults worked in near-silent coordination, communicating through gestures and terse phrases. Sarah stroked the mare's neck, whispering reassurances in the same tone she'd used with frightened students. The animal's dark eyes, wild with pain and fear, gradually calmed under her steady hands. "There!" Jackson finally exclaimed as something shifted within the mare's body. Got it turned right way round. Minutes later, slick with birth fluids and effort, a spindly-legged foal emerged into the world. The mare struggled to her feet with remarkable speed, turning to nuzzle her newborn with instinctive devotion. "Perfect little filly," James said, his face transformed by a rare, full smile. "Strong, too, after such a fight to be born." Sarah couldn't look away from the miracle unfolding before her. The foal already attempting to stand on wobbly legs, the mother's gentle encouragement. Life asserting itself with determined vigor, heedless of the difficulty of its beginning. She became aware of her appearance then, hair escaping its pins, dress smeared with straw and unspeakable fluids, hands grimy with honest labor. Nothing like the polished Boston teacher she'd been just yesterday. Strangely, the realization brought no dismay, only a curious lightness. "You're a marvel, Miss Fleming," James said quietly, helping her to her feet. "Not many city women would have pitched in like that. Not many were raised by a father who believed his daughters should be useful as well as ornamental," she replied, attempting to tidy her hair with limited success. Jackson, who hadn't spoken directly to her before, gave a gruff nod of approval. Mare might have lost the foal without your steady hand, ma'am. We're obliged. The simple acknowledgement of her contribution filled Sarah with unexpected pride. When had Herbert Crawford ever valued her practical abilities? His letters had praised her refinement, her education, her suitable background, never her capacity for meaningful work. "What will you name her?" Sarah asked, watching the foal take its first tentative steps. James considered the question with surprising seriousness. "Thought maybe you might like to do the honors." "Me? But I'm only passing through. Some folks leave more of a mark in 3 days than others do in years," Jackson observed cryptically before excusing himself to tend other animals. Left alone with James beside the new mother and foal, Sarah felt a strange intimacy settle between them, the kind that comes from shared work and common purpose. She should have a strong name, Sarah decided, watching the filly nuzzle her mother's flank. Something fitting for a creature who fought so hard to enter the world. "Like someone else I recently met," James said quietly. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implied compliment. "Perhaps Perseverance? Percy for everyday use." Perseverance. James tested the name, then nodded approval. "It suits her." They stood in companionable silence, watching the new life they'd helped usher into the world. Sarah became acutely aware of James beside her. His height, his solid presence, the capable hands now gentle as he stroked the mare's neck. So different from Herbert Crawford's manicured fingers that had never known real work. The unbidden comparison startled her. Why should she be thinking of her former fiancé in this way? Measuring him against James McKinnon seemed both unfair and unnecessary. They were men of entirely different worlds after all. Yet the thought persisted as they made their way back to the main house, where Mrs. Wilson waited with hot water, clean towels, and a knowing expression that made Sarah flush anew. "Got herself a fine filly," James reported, the pride evident in his voice. Sarah helped turn it when it was coming wrong. Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows rose fractionally at his use of her first name, but her only comment was practical. "Then Miss Fleming will be wanting a bath before dinner. Tommy, fetch more water. James, make yourself scarce while I help her get presentable." As Sarah soaked in the tin bath later, steam rising around her like morning mist on the prairie, she found herself smiling at the day's unexpected turns, from accounts to foaling, from despair to purpose, all in the space of 24 hours. Outside her small window, she could see James in the corral, his tall figure unmistakable as he worked with a young horse. The animal pranced nervously, but James's movements remained calm and deliberate, his patience evident even at a distance. Sarah thought of Herbert Crawford's fastidious impatience, his irritation at any delay or inconvenience. Another comparison, unbidden yet impossible to ignore. "This won't do," she murmured to herself, sinking deeper into the bath. You can't measure every man against James McKinnon simply because he showed you kindness when you needed it most. Yet, as she dressed in her last clean gown, a simple grey cotton, suitable for an evening at home, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within her. Not just her circumstances, but her very understanding of what she wanted from life, and the most troubling realization of all. Her ticket for Thursday's eastbound train, tucked safely in her reticule, no longer felt like salvation. It felt like retreat. Wednesday dawned with an ominous bank of clouds gathering on the western horizon. The air held the metallic tang of approaching rain, a blessing for drought-parched land, but a complication for Sarah's impending departure. Tomorrow's train would take her back east, back to the life interrupted by Herbert Crawford's rejection, a life that now felt like a poorly fitting garment after just 2 days at McKinnon Ranch. "Storm coming," James observed over breakfast, his gaze fixed on the darkening. "Sky outside. Might be a bad one." Mrs. Wilson nodded sagely. "Barometric pressure's dropping fast. Feel it in my joints." Will it affect the train schedule? Sarah asked, trying to ignore the conflicting emotions the question stirred within her. James met, her eyes across the table. Depends how heavy it hits. Spring storms can wash out sections of track sometimes. I see. Sarah busied herself with her coffee cup, avoiding the unspoken question in his gaze. Had he noticed her growing reluctance to leave? The way she'd lingered in the study last night, organizing not just current accounts, but planning for future. "And either way," Mrs. Wilson said briskly, "we've work to do before it breaks. Preserves need moving to higher shelves in the root cellar in case of flooding, and the young stock needs extra feed. I'd like to help," Sarah offered immediately. "Perhaps with the preserves?" Mrs. Wilson's sharp eyes assessed her. "You're our guest, Miss Fleming. No obligation to—" "Please," Sarah interrupted gently, "I'd prefer to be useful." Something in her tone must have conveyed her deeper need to belong, if only briefly, to this world so different from her own. Mrs. Wilson nodded once decisively. "Very well. James, you and Tommy see to the livestock. Miss Fleming and I will handle the house preparations." As everyone dispersed to their tasks, Sarah caught James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Part wonder, part wistfulness, part something deeper that made her heart quicken despite her best efforts. The root cellar proved to be a cool, earthy space beneath the main house, its rough shelves laden with Mrs. Wilson's impressive array of preserved bounty. Together, the women worked efficiently, lifting jars of summer vegetables, fruits and meats to higher ground. "You've done this before," Mrs. Wilson observed as Sarah expertly stacked jars in stable formations. "My grandmother's cellar in Massachusetts," Sarah explained. "Similar concerns, different landscape." Mrs. Wilson handed her another jar of preserved peaches. "Been meaning to ask, though it's none of my business." "Yes?" Sarah prompted when the older woman hesitated. "What exactly happened? With Crawford? Town gossip says one thing, but I'd wager the truth is another matter entirely." Sarah's hands stilled on the jar. She'd shared the broad outlines with James, but had avoided the humiliating details. Yet somehow, Mrs. Wilson's straightforward manner made the truth easier to speak. "His mother and sisters objected to my height," she said simply. 5'1" is apparently insufficient for a man of 6'2". They feared—" she swallowed hard. "They feared we would look comical together, that people would laugh at him for marrying so far beneath him, in stature, that is." Mrs. Wilson's expression darkened. "Fools." Herbert agreed with them. "In the end," Sarah continued, the sting of rejection still fresh. "Hence the telegram, awaiting me in Chicago, after I'd already traveled more than halfway." "And you still came," Mrs. Wilson marveled. "Most women would have turned back immediately." Sarah carefully placed the peach jar on the highest shelf. "I've spent my life being overlooked because of my height, teachers assuming I was younger, students initially dismissing my authority, men speaking over my head as if I weren't present. I couldn't bear to let it defeat me one more time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Pride's not always a sin," Mrs. Wilson said approvingly. "Sometimes it's just self-respect by another name." The simple validation, so different from Boston's carefully couched criticisms, brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, focusing on the task at hand. "What about you?" she asked, turning the conversation. "How did you come to be so involved with the McKinnon Ranch?" Mrs. Wilson's weathered face softened. "My late husband worked this land alongside James. After both Mary and John passed, different illnesses, same terrible year, it seemed natural to continue together. Not romantically," she clarified quickly. "Just two people helping each other. Survive grief. And Tommy, my youngest, boy worships the ground James walks on." Pride and fond exasperation colored her tone. "James has been teaching him ranching business, everything a father would. Don't know what we'd have done without him these past years." The revelation cast James in yet another light, not just a grieving widower or capable rancher, but a man who extended himself for others despite his own losses, a stark contrast to Herbert Crawford, whose charity work in Boston had always seemed calculated for maximum social advantage. Another unfavorable comparison. Sarah was collecting them like pressed flowers. They finished the cellar work just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached the house, the sky had opened completely, rain sheeting down in silver curtains that transformed the landscape. James and Tommy arrived moments later, soaked to the skin, but satisfied with their preparations. "Animals are secure," James reported, removing his dripping hat. "Extra hay in the high pasture for the cattle, horses in the barn." And just in time, Mrs. Wilson observed as thunder rumbled ominously overhead. "This one's settling in for a proper visit." The rest of the day passed in comfortable domesticity, the storm creating a cocoon around the ranch house that made the outside world seem distant and unimportant. Sarah darned socks by the fire, while James repaired tack at the table. Mrs. Wilson baked bread, its yeasty fragrance filling the house with warmth. Tommy read aloud from one of Mary's beloved novels, his young voice stumbling occasionally over unfamiliar words that Sarah gently corrected. It felt dangerously like belonging. By evening, the storm had intensified. Wind howled around the eaves, rain lashed the windows, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the prairie in stark, blue-white tableau. After supper, Mrs. Wilson announced she and Tommy would stay overnight, rather than risk the short but potentially treacherous journey to their own cabin. "I'll take the parlor sofa," she declared. "Tommy can bed down by the fire." The rearrangement left Sarah and James briefly alone in the kitchen as they finished the washing up. Thunder cracked overhead, startlingly close. "Will the train still run tomorrow if this continues?" Sarah asked, the question that had hovered all day finally finding voice. James handed her a plate to dry. "Hard to say. Depends on whether the creek floods the low track by Miller's Crossing." Sarah nodded, focusing intently on the dish towel in her hands. "I should check before making the journey to town. Could telegraph the station in the morning if the lines are still up." Another flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen in harsh relief, catching James's expression, a complex mixture of concern and something that looked remarkably like hope. "Would it be terrible," Sarah began, hardly believing her own boldness, "if I admitted part of me wishes the train couldn't come?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James went very still, the dish in his hands forgotten. "Sarah, forget I spoke," she said hurriedly. "It was merely a foolish—" "No." His voice was soft but firm. "Not foolish, just unexpected." Thunder rumbled again, underscoring the tension between them. Lightning flashed, and in its brief illumination, Sarah saw James's face with startling clarity, the conflicted emotions, the cautious yearning, the fear of hoping for too much. "I've known you 3 days," he said slowly. "Feels like longer." "Yes," she agreed, understanding completely. "You've brought something back to this place that's been missing since Mary died. Not just organization or practical help, though God knows I needed both." He set down the dish carefully. "You've brought purpose. Life." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "James, A tremendous crash from outside interrupted her words. James was instantly alert, moving to the window. Lightning struck something close. Maybe the old oak by the... He stopped abruptly. "The barn! Part of the roof's down!" He was moving before the words fully registered, grabbing his coat and hat from their pegs. Sarah followed instinctively. "The horses?" she gasped, remembering the animals they'd secured earlier, including newborn Percy and her mother. "Stay here," James ordered, already pulling on his boots. "I will not," Sarah retorted, reaching for her shawl. "Those animals need help." Mrs. Wilson appeared in the doorway, Tommy close behind. "What's happened?" "Barn roof's partially collapsed," James explained tersely. "Going to check the animals." "I'll come with—" Tommy began. "No," James and Mrs. Wilson said simultaneously. "You stay with your mother," James continued. "If things worsen, I'll need you to ride for help." The boy clearly wanted to argue, but subsided under his mother's stern gaze. James turned back to Sarah, his expression grave. "It's dangerous out there," Sarah lifted her chin. "I'm aware." Something in her stance, the determination perhaps, or the utter absence of fear, seemed to decide him. With a brief nod, he handed her an oilskin coat that engulfed her small frame. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "Step where I step." The moment they stepped outside, Sarah understood his caution. The rain was a solid wall of water, the wind a howling beast that threatened to sweep her off her feet. Only James's steadying hand at her elbow kept her grounded as they made their way toward the barn, where orange flames were now visible through the collapsed section of roof. "Lightning started a fire!" James shouted over the storm's fury. "We need to get the horses out." The barn's interior was chaos. Frightened animals, smouldering hay, a section of roof open to the elements where lightning had torn through the structure. The fire was spreading quickly, despite the rain pouring through the gap. James moved with decisive efficiency, opening stalls and guiding panicked horses toward the exit. Sarah followed his lead, her small stature actually an advantage as she ducked beneath rearing hooves to reach the mare and newborn foal in the last stall. "Easy, Percy," she called, trying to project calm she didn't feel. "Easy, girl." The terrified foal huddled against her mother, eyes rolling white with fear. The mare snorted and stamped, torn between protective instinct and panic. "James," Sarah called, "the foal can't walk through this." He appeared beside her, assessing the situation with a glance. Without hesitation, he scooped the gangly newborn into his arms, its weight substantial but manageable for his powerful frame. "Can you lead the mare?" he asked. Sarah nodded, taking the halter with confident hands. "Go, we'll follow." Together they made their way through the burning barn, the mare surprisingly compliant with her foal in sight ahead. Outside, rain continued to hammer down, but it was a blessing now, dousing the embers clinging to their clothing. They managed to secure the horses in a secondary shelter, a three-sided structure normally used for equipment. Soaked, filthy, and exhausted, they finally turned back toward the house, where lamplight glowed like a beacon through the storm. Halfway there, Sarah stumbled, her legs finally giving out after the intense exertion. Before she could fall, James swept her into his arms as easily as he had carried the foal, his height allowing him to hold her well above the deepening mud. "Put me down," she protested weakly. "I can walk." "You can," he agreed, continuing to carry her nonetheless. "But you don't have to." Too exhausted to argue further, Sarah allowed herself to relax against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her cheek. For the first time in her adult life, she felt genuinely small, not diminished or overlooked, but preciously protected. "Never thought I'd be grateful for my height," she murmured, the words nearly lost in the storm's roar. James looked down at her, rain streaming from the brim of his hat. "Your height?" 5'1" has certain advantages in a burning barn. She managed a tired smile. "I didn't have to duck." His laugh rumbled through his chest, a warm vibration against her side. "Sarah Fleming, you are a wonder." As they reached the porch, Mrs. Wilson flung the door open, relief evident on her face. Behind her, Tommy was already gathering towels and blankets. "Animals?" she asked tersely. "Safe," James confirmed, reluctantly setting Sarah on her feet in the shelter of the porch. All accounted for, including our young perseverance. The pride in his voice when he said "our" did not escape Sarah's notice, nor, judging by her shrewd expression, did it escape Mrs. Wilson's. Later, dried and changed into borrowed nightclothes, Sarah sat by the fire nursing a cup of hot tea laced with medicinal whiskey. The storm continued its assault outside, but within the ranch house, a different kind of tempest brewed, one of emotions too complex to easily name. James settled in the chair opposite, his own tea cradled in hands, still reddened from fire and rescue. Their eyes met over the rim of their cups, a world of unspoken words passing between them. "The train," he said finally, breaking the charged silence. "Yes," she acknowledged. "Tomorrow." Neither mentioned what they both knew, that the tracks would almost certainly be washed out, that no train could possibly run after such a deluge. It was a reprieve neither dared acknowledge openly, a gift of time they had no right to expect. "If you were to stay," James began carefully, "not forever necessarily, but longer than tomorrow." Sarah held her breath, the cup warm between her. "In palms. Would that be something you might consider?" he finished, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Before she could answer, Mrs. Wilson appeared from the kitchen, her timing suspiciously convenient. "Telegraph lines are down," she announced. "Just heard it from the Hendersons' hand, who rode through checking on neighbors." "The tracks?" James asked, though they all knew the answer. "Flooded for certain. No train for at least 3 days, maybe. More." The older woman's expression was deliberately neutral. "Miss Fleming will need to extend her stay, it seems." "I wouldn't want to impose," Sarah said automatically, though her heart leapt at the news. "Nonsense!" Mrs. Wilson dismissed the concern with a wave. "Way you handled yourself in that barn fire, you're more asset than imposition." The practical approval, so different from Boston society's superficial compliments, warmed Sarah more than the fire or whiskied tea. "Besides," Mrs. Wilson continued, her tone deceptively casual, "seems to me a woman with your skills might find opportunity in Clearwater if she were of a mind to look for it." The suggestion hung in the air, ripe with possibility. Sarah looked to James, finding his blue eyes fixed on her with undisguised hope. "3 more days," she said softly, neither accepting nor rejecting the veiled proposition. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" "Indeed he does," Mrs. Wilson agreed with satisfaction. "Indeed he does." Outside, the storm raged on, but its fury seemed diminished somehow, less an obstacle than a divine intervention, forcing pause in a journey too hastily planned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, repairs, clean-up, decisions that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. But tonight, warmed by fire and shared purpose, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different future than the one she'd envisioned just 3 days ago. A future where her height was irrelevant, where her worth was measured by capability rather than convention, where a tall rancher looked at her, all 5'1" of her, and saw not inadequacy but perfect proportion. It was still just a fragile possibility, a seedling rather than a certainty. But as Sarah caught James's gaze across the hearth, she felt it taking root in fertile soil. A new dream, unexpected yet somehow more authentic than the one that had brought her west. 3 days stretched into a week as spring rains continued to swell the creeks and wash out sections of railroad track. Telegraph lines remained down, isolating Clearwater from the wider world. Under different circumstances, Sarah might have fretted about the delay, about her position at Miss Prendergast's, about her abandoned trunk at the station. Instead, she found herself embracing each day at McKinnon Ranch with growing certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The morning, Sun glinted off puddles as Sarah made her way to the repaired barn. The storm's damage had been substantial, but not devastating. With the help of neighbors who'd arrived the following day, they'd managed to rebuild the collapsed section and salvage most of the stored hay. Inside, Percy nickered a greeting, her gangly legs steadier now as she approached the familiar human. Sarah offered an apple slice, marveling at how quickly the foal had taken to her. She knows who helped bring her into this world. James's deep voice came from behind her, startling Sarah from her reverie. "Good morning," she said, turning to find him watching her with undisguised admiration. "I was just checking on our patient." "Our patient seems to be thriving." He moved beside her, close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth radiating from his tall frame. "As is someone else I've been watching." Sarah felt color rise in her cheeks. "I've always adapted easily to new circumstances. This is more than adaptation, Sarah." His voice softened as he reached out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture achingly tender. "This is transformation." The week had changed them both. James had shed some of his solitary habits, seeking her company even for mundane tasks. Sarah had abandoned her corseted formality, adopting simpler dress and looser hair that better suited ranch life. "The tracks will be repaired by tomorrow," he said, the words hanging heavy between them. "Station master sent word this morning." Sarah's heart contracted painfully. The reprieve was ending. Decision time had arrived. "I see," she managed, turning back to Percy to hide the conflict in her eyes. "I've been thinking," James continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon visible through the barn door, "about what you said regarding the children hereabouts lacking education." Sarah nodded, remembering their conversation at that first dinner. "It's a genuine concern. Clearwater's growing. New families arriving every month. There's talk of establishing a proper school, but no teacher willing to come this far west." He paused meaningfully. "No teacher until now, perhaps." The implication was clear. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "James, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing," he interrupted gently. "I'm asking, directly." He turned to face her. Fully, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "Stay, Sarah, not just another week or month. Stay permanently. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "As Clearwater's teacher?" she clarified, heart hammering. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That too." The simple acknowledgement of his deeper meaning flooded Sarah with contradictory emotions: joy, fear, hope, uncertainty. She moved away slightly, needing distance to think clearly. "We've known each other a week," she reminded him, though whether she was cautioning him or herself wasn't entirely clear. "I knew Mary was the woman I'd marry within 2 days of meeting her," James replied, unembarrassed by the admission. "Some things a person just knows, and you know about me." Sarah hardly dared believe what she was hearing. James approached slowly, as he might a skittish colt. "I know that when you arrive in a room, it feels fuller, brighter. I know that you see problems as puzzles to solve, not burdens to bear. I know that your height has nothing to do with your stature as a woman." Each word was like a balm to wounds Sarah hadn't realized were still raw. She'd spent so long being judged for her physical limitations that James's focus on her character felt revolutionary. "The town might think it strange," she warned, voicing one of many practical concerns. "A man of your height, with a woman of mine. The town already thinks it's strange that I invited a stranded Boston teacher to stay at my ranch," he countered with a hint of humor. "Might as well give them something worth gossiping about." Despite herself, Sarah laughed. "You make it sound so simple. It is simple, he insisted, closing the distance between them. Not easy, perhaps, but simple. Do you feel at home here, Sarah? Not just at the ranch, but in this life. The question cut through pretense and propriety to the heart of the matter. Did she belong here in this vast landscape where people were judged by character rather than convention? Yes, she admitted softly, more than I ever felt at home in Boston. Then stay. He reached for her hands, engulfing them in his own. Teach our children. Help me run the ranch. Build something meaningful here. As your wife? The word emerged, barely above a whisper. As my partner, he clarified. My equal, my queen. The unexpected word choice made her blink in surprise. Queen? James smiled, a rare, full expression that transformed his serious face. That's how I've thought of you since the barn fire. Small in stature but mighty in command. A queen among women. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, not of sorrow, but wonder. Herbert Crawford had seen her height as a liability, a source of potential ridicule. James McKinnon saw it as irrelevant to her true worth. I need to go to Clearwater, she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. To send telegrams, to resign my position properly, to collect my trunk. Hope flared in James's eyes. And then? And then, Sarah continued, squeezing his large hands with her small ones, I would like to discuss terms for establishing Clearwater's first proper school, and other matters of a more personal nature. It wasn't an outright acceptance, but the promise in her words was unmistakable. James lifted her hands to his lips, his kiss warming her skin even as his eyes warmed her heart. I'll hitch the wagon, he said simply. Clearwater was abuzz with activity when they arrived, the town emerging from storm isolation with renewed energy. The station platform bustled with workers repairing telegraph equipment, while merchants received long-delayed deliveries. Sarah felt the stares as she walked beside James toward the telegraph office, her small figure in stark contrast to his towering height. Unlike in Boston, where such scrutiny would have made her shrink into herself, she found herself standing straighter, drawing strength from the very difference others might mock. Miss Fleming. Station Master Peterson hurried over, curiosity practically radiating from him. We'd wondered if you'd be taking tomorrow's train. Your trunk's been safely stored, though it's gathered quite a bit of dust. Thank you, Mr. Peterson, Sarah replied with dignity. I'll need to access it today, but as for tomorrow's train... She glanced at James, who maintained a carefully neutral expression. I find my plans have changed. Peterson's eyebrows shot up. Changed, you say? Staying in Clearwater a while longer, then? Perhaps permanently, Sarah confirmed, taking quiet satisfaction in the station master's poorly concealed astonishment. I understand the town has need of a teacher. Well, I'll be... Peterson's gaze darted between them, fresh gossip practically visible in his gleaming eyes. That's quite a development, Miss Fleming. Indeed it is, James interjected smoothly. Now, if you'll direct us to Miss Fleming's trunk? We have several errands to complete today. The telegraph office was their next stop. Sarah composed 3 messages with careful consideration. One to Miss Prendergast tendering her resignation, one to her sister in Boston requesting her remaining possessions be shipped west, and a final one to Herbert Crawford. This last gave her pause, pen hovering over paper, as she considered what to say to the man whose rejection had inadvertently led her to genuine happiness. Second thoughts? James asked quietly from beside her. No, Sarah replied firmly. Just seeking the right words. In the end, she kept it simple. Found my place where height matters not. Wishing you similar happiness, Sarah Fleming. It wasn't spite or triumphalism that motivated the message, but a genuine desire for closure, for herself as much as for Crawford. The life she might have had as his wife now seemed like a pale imitation of the one unfolding before her. Their final stop was Thompson's General Store, where news of Sarah's decision to stay had somehow preceded them. Emma Thompson greeted them with barely concealed delight. "Miss Fleming, heard you might be staying on as our school teacher." The shopkeeper's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Though I suspect teaching isn't the only position you'll be filling in our community." "Mrs. Thompson," James acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Miss Fleming requires supplies for her extended stay and information about available buildings that might serve as a schoolhouse." "Well, as to that," Emma replied, "the town council met just yesterday. They've approved funds to renovate the old meeting hall, with a qualified teacher available," she added meaningfully. "Education has suddenly become a priority." Sarah bit back a smile at the transparent matchmaking. "I'd need to inspect the space, of course, and discuss curriculum expectations, compensation of—" Of course," Emma agreed readily. "Mayor Crawford would be happy to—" "Oh," she stopped, mortified. "That is, his son Herbert has returned east, but the mayor himself—" "It's quite all right, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah assured her, surprised. To find the mention of the Crawford name stirred no particular emotion. "The past is past. I'd be pleased to meet with Mayor Crawford about the position." As they gathered supplies, practical clothing better suited to ranch life, teaching materials, personal necessities, Sarah felt a growing lightness. Each item chosen represented not just practicality, but commitment to her new path. "You haven't actually said yes," James observed quietly as they loaded their purchases into the wagon. "To my personal question, that is." Sarah arranged a parcel carefully before turning to face him. "I haven't, have I?" His expression remained patient, but she didn't miss the uncertainty in his eyes. For a man of such physical presence, James McKinnon could be remarkably vulnerable. "I wanted to be sure," she explained, "that I was choosing this life for the right reasons, not from wounded pride or fear of returning east in disgrace, but because it's truly where I belong." "And have you decided?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah glanced around at the bustling town, at the vast landscape beyond, at the man before her who saw her true measure. Her hands, small but capable, reached for his. "Yes," she said simply, "to all of it, to teaching, to the ranch, to you." The joy that transformed James's face was answer enough, but he lifted her hands to his heart, holding them against his steady beat. "You're certain? It won't be easy. Ranch life is hard in the best of times." "I'm certain," Sarah confirmed, "though I have one condition." His eyebrows rose in question. "We must send Mrs. Wilson flowers," she said with mock seriousness. "She's been matchmaking since the moment I arrived." James laughed, the sound drawing curious glances from passers-by. "Tommy too. Boy's been dropping hints like anvils all week." Their shared laughter felt like a seal on the decision, more binding than any formal agreement. As James helped her into the wagon, his hands at her waist lifted her as if she weighed nothing, setting her gently on the seat before climbing up beside her. "There will be talk," he warned, nodding toward several townspeople openly watching their departure. "Let them talk," Sarah replied with newfound confidence. "I've spent too long worrying what others think of my stature. It's time to stand tall in the life I've chosen." The ride back to the ranch was filled with plans and possibilities. Sarah described her vision for the school. James outlined improvements for the ranch house. Both wove their separate dreams into a shared future with surprising ease. As they crested the final rise overlooking McKinnon Ranch, Sarah asked James to stop the wagon. The late afternoon sun bathed the homestead in golden light, transforming the modest buildings into something approaching magnificence. "When I arrived at Clearwater Station a week ago," she said, drinking in the view, "I thought my life was ending, that I'd made a terrible mistake in coming west at all." James's hand found hers on the wagon seat. And now I understand it. Wasn't a mistake, but a redirection. She turned to him, her face luminous with certainty. Herbert Crawford rejected me for being too short. You never saw my height at all. You saw me. Not entirely true, James corrected gently. I see your height. It's part of you, like my height is part of me, but neither defines us. No, Sarah agreed. What defines us are the choices we make, the courage we show, the love we offer. She squeezed his hand. I choose this life, James McKinnon. I choose you. In answer, he bent toward her, closing the considerable distance between their heights, to kiss her with unmistakable promise. When they separated, his blue eyes held hers with tender intensity. My queen, he murmured, the endearment no longer peculiar but perfect. As the wagon rolled down the final slope toward home, for it was home now, irrevocably, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness settle in her bones. The Boston schoolteacher, too short for Herbert Crawford's social aspirations, had found her true measure in Wyoming's vast expanses. She had not grown taller, but her spirit had expanded to fill the landscape around her. And beside her sat a man who understood that the distance between 5'1" and 6'4" was no distance at all when measured by the heart. 3 months later, when they stood before Reverend Thomas in Clearwater's white clapboard church, their height difference drew smiles but no mockery from the assembled townsfolk, especially not after James, in a moment of uncharacteristic theatricality, lifted his bride in his arms after their vows, raising her to his eye level as he proclaimed, "My Queen of the Prairie, perfect in every measure." And Sarah Fleming McKinnon, 5'1" in her wedding slippers, had never stood taller. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The 3 weeks following Sarah's decision to stay in Clearwater passed in a whirlwind of activity. The old meeting hall underwent a remarkable transformation under her direction, its weathered walls scrubbed clean, windows repaired and sturdy. Benches arranged in neat rows. Books ordered from Denver arrived by stagecoach, primers, arithmetic texts, and even a modest collection of literature that Sarah had selected with careful consideration for the frontier children's education. 2 days before the school's official opening, Sarah stood in the center of the classroom, savoring the moment of quiet accomplishment. Morning light slanted through freshly washed windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny messengers between her past and present. "Looks like a proper school," James observed from the doorway, his tall frame nearly touching the lintel above him. "Town's been buzzing about it all week." Sarah smiled, turning to face him. 12 students enrolled already, with 3 more families considering it. "Not surprising," James said, stepping inside. "Folks around here want more for their children than they had themselves." The past weeks had established a comfortable rhythm between them, Sarah dividing her time between preparations for the school and learning the workings of the ranch, James teaching her to ride properly, to identify edible plants, to handle the challenges of Wyoming seasons. They took supper together each evening, sharing the events of their days with growing ease. Yet beneath this domesticity ran an undercurrent of uncertainty. Their relationship existed in a curious limbo, more than friendship, less than courtship, undefined yet undeniably deepening with each passing day. "I visited your ranch today," Sarah said, straightening a row of primers on the teacher's desk. "Mrs. Wilson was baking bread and insisted I take some for our supper." James's expression warmed at the casual way she referred to our supper, a small but significant acknowledgement of their shared life. "Tommy mentioned you were looking at the north pasture." "I was," Sarah confirmed. The irrigation system you described could work quite well there. I've sketched some calculations based on similar projects in agricultural journals. You've been studying irrigation methods? James asked, surprise evident in his voice. Sarah met his gaze directly. I believe my role here extends beyond the schoolroom, James. If I'm to be part of this community, part of your life, then I want to contribute meaningfully to the ranch as well. The boldness of her statement hung in the air between them. Neither had spoken so directly about their future since that rain-soaked night when Sarah had first acknowledged her desire to stay. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. James crossed the classroom in 3 long strides, stopping before her. Even standing on the teacher's platform, Sarah barely reached his shoulder, a fact that no longer bothered her as it once might have. I want to show you something, he said, his deep voice carrying a note of decision. Can you ride out with me this afternoon? Of course, Sarah replied, curiosity piqued by the intensity in his blue eyes. Where are we going? You'll see when we get there, was all he would say, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The afternoon found them riding westward from town, Sarah comfortably astride the gentle mare James had been training her on. October had painted the landscape in burnished gold and copper, the aspen groves shimmering like flame against the deeper green of pine forests that climbed the distant mountains. James led them along a winding creek, through meadows still lush. Despite the advancing season, Sarah had grown to love these rides, savoring the vast openness that had initially terrified her eastern sensibilities. Where once she'd seen emptiness, she now recognized abundance. Hawks circling on thermals, deer browsing in sheltered valleys, wildflowers stubbornly blooming in protected hollows. After an hour's ride, James guided them up a gentle slope to a promontory overlooking the valley they'd traversed. Below, the land spread out in a natural basin, sheltered by ridges on 3 sides, with the creek curving through its center. It's beautiful, Sarah said, genuinely moved by the vista before them. It's yours, James replied simply. Or it could be, if you wanted it. Sarah turned to him, confused. I don't understand. James dismounted, then helped her down from her mare. Taking her hand, he led her to the edge of the promontory. This land belongs to the McKinnon Ranch, he explained. Has since my father first claimed it 30 years ago, but I've never done anything with this particular section. He gestured toward the basin below. Good water, sheltered from the worst. Winter winds, soil rich enough for orchards. The word caught Sarah's attention immediately. Orchards? You mentioned once that you'd always wanted fruit trees, James said, watching her face carefully. Said your grandmother had an apple orchard in Massachusetts that you loved as a child. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's breath caught. She had indeed shared that memory one evening as they sat on his porch watching the sunset, a casual reminiscence she hadn't expected him to remember, much less act upon. James, she began, emotion thickening her voice. Are you saying, I'm saying that I've staked out 10 acres here, he continued, his own voice deeper than usual. Had the boundaries marked officially last week. It's deeded in your name, Sarah. Fleming, in my name, she repeated, stunned by the magnitude of the gesture. But why would you? Because I want you to have something that's truly yours, James said with simple directness. Something that can't be taken away, that doesn't depend on anyone else's goodwill or decisions. He paused, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of uncertainty. If you decide that a life with me isn't what you want, this land remains yours regardless. The implication struck Sarah with force. James wasn't just offering her property. He was offering her independence, the freedom to choose him rather than necessity or convenience. "You've thought about this a great deal," she observed, struggling to process the emotions flooding through her. "I've thought about little else since that first day at the station," James admitted, "about what a woman like you needs to thrive. In this territory, it's not just shelter or protection." He turned to face her fully. "It's the dignity of choice, Sarah, something Herbert Crawford never offered you." The mention of her former fiancé no longer stung as it once had. Herbert had become a distant figure in her mind, fading in significance with each day she spent in Wyoming. "I don't know what to say," Sarah finally managed, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness behind James's gift. "You don't need to say anything yet," he assured her, his expression softening. "The land is yours whether or not—" He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders with characteristic resolve. "Whether or not you decide to accept my proposal." "Proposal?" Sarah's heart leapt to her throat. James reached into his pocket and withdrew something that glinted in the afternoon sunlight. A simple gold band, unadorned, but beautifully crafted. "I had it made in Cheyenne," he explained, holding it between his fingers. "Sized small enough to fit you properly." The significance wasn't lost on Sarah. After being rejected for her height, here was a man who had carefully ensured that even her wedding ring would be proportioned to her size, not as an accommodation, but as a celebration of who she was. Sarah. "Fleming," James said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "I find myself in the unexpected position of loving a woman I've known barely a month. I can offer you a life that will never be easy, on a ranch that's still struggling to find its footing, in a territory most Eastern women would find unbearably primitive." He paused, a smile touching his lips. "But I can also promise that you'll never be overlooked or undervalued here, that your height will never matter except when you need me to reach the high shelves, and that I will spend every day grateful that Herbert Crawford was fool enough to let you go." Sarah felt tears threatening, but they were different from the bitter ones she'd shed on that train platform a month earlier. These were born of recognition, of being truly seen by another person for perhaps the first time in her life. "The school term begins in 2 days," she said, her voice catching slightly. "It would be scandalous for the teacher to marry quite so hastily, don't you think?" Hope flickered in James's eyes. "Are you suggesting a proper engagement period?" "Perhaps until Christmas," Sarah proposed, her practical nature asserting itself even in this emotional moment. "Long enough to quiet the gossips, short enough that we needn't wait forever." "Christmas," James repeated, as if testing the word. 2 months. "I suppose I can be patient that long, having already waited 39 years to find you." He took her hand, his massive palm dwarfing her smaller one, and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as he'd promised. "There's something fitting about this," Sarah observed, looking at their joined hands. "You being so tall, me being so small, like the land itself, mountains and valleys, each defined by the other." James's laugh rumbled deep in his chest. "Poetry from my practical Boston schoolteacher? Wyoming is changing you already." "You're changing me," Sarah corrected gently. "Or perhaps just allowing me to become who I always should have been." The October sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land that was now hers. In the valley below, Sarah could already envision apple trees standing in neat rows, their spring blossoms and fall harvests marking the passage of years to come. Years she would spend not as Mrs. Herbert Crawford, too short and inadequate, but as Mrs. James McKinnon, a frontier teacher, a rancher's wife, and eventually perhaps a mother. The future stretched before her, as vast and promising as the Wyoming sky. "We should head back," James said reluctantly. Storm brewing to the north. Sure enough, dark clouds were gathering over the distant peaks, their underbellies tinged with the purple grey that promised serious weather. Is it snow? Sarah asked, still unfamiliar with Wyoming's meteorological patterns. First of the season, likely, James confirmed, helping her mount her mare. Winter comes early up here. As they rode back toward Clearwater, the wind carrying the scent of approaching snow, Sarah found herself untroubled by the prospect of harsh weather. She had survived rejection and abandonment, crossed a continent, and found not just refuge, but purpose in this wild country. A Wyoming winter held no terror for a woman who had already weathered life's colder seasons and emerged stronger for the experience. "Race you to that ridge," she called impulsively to James, urging her mare forward with newfound confidence. His surprised laugh followed her as she galloped ahead, her small figure straight and sure in the saddle, perfectly proportioned to the vast landscape that had become her home. The promised snow arrived that night, blanketing Clearwater in 6 inches of pristine white by morning. Sarah stood at the schoolhouse window, watching children navigate the newly transformed landscape with whoops of delight, their breath clouding in the crisp air as they hurled snowballs and carved tracks with improvised sleds. Tomorrow would mark her first official day as Clearwater's teacher. The ledger on her desk contained 12 names, ranging from 6-year-old Mary Beth Peterson to 16-year-old Thomas Wilson, the ranch hand who had looked at her with such hope when she'd offered evening lessons in advanced mathematics. Sarah traced her fingers over the fresh ink, each name representing trust placed in her by frontier families who valued education enough to spare their children from chores for precious daylight hours. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly. Knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Emma Thompson entered, arms laden with a patchwork quilt in vibrant blues and greens. "For your desk," the shopkeeper explained, unfolding the handmade offering. "Winters get bitter in the schoolhouse. This'll keep your lap warm while you're teaching." "It's beautiful," Sarah said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness. "Did you make it yourself?" Emma nodded, a hint of pride in her expression. "Been working on it since you decided to stay. Seemed fitting for our new teacher to have something proper to start with." The gesture represented more than mere practicality. It was acceptance, acknowledgement of Sarah's place in the community. In the weeks since her decision to remain in Clearwater, similar gifts had appeared. Honey from the Hendersons' hives, a sturdy bookshelf crafted by Mr. Johnson the carpenter, wildflower seeds from Mrs. Wilson for spring planting. The whole town's. "Talking about your engagement?" Emma continued, smoothing the quilt over Sarah's desk. "Though I can't say anyone's particularly surprised." Sarah's cheeks warmed. News of James's proposal had spread through Clearwater with the efficiency that only small towns can achieve. "It's all happened rather quickly. Out here, folks don't waste time once they know their minds," Emma replied pragmatically. "Life's too uncertain for lengthy courtships." She paused, studying Sarah with motherly concern. "You're sure about this? About him?" The question deserved honest consideration. Despite the relatively short time they'd known each other, Sarah felt more certain about James McKinnon than she ever had about Herbert Crawford after 6 months of correspondence. "I'm sure," she answered simply. "He sees me as I am, not as someone to be tolerated despite my shortcomings." Emma nodded, satisfied. "Well, that's love for you. Sees clear when others see cloudy." She adjusted the quilt one final time. "Christmas. Wedding then?" "Christmas Eve," Sarah confirmed. "Small ceremony, just the community." "Nothing stays small in Clearwater," Emma warned with a chuckle. "Half the county will turn out once word spreads. First wedding since the miller's last spring, and that was hardly a celebration with his mother sick as she was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The prospect of a larger ceremony than anticipated might once have flustered Sarah. Now she merely smiled, recognizing it as part of the fabric of small-town life, the shared celebrations that bound isolated homesteads and scattered ranches into a community. After Emma departed, Sarah returned to her preparations, organizing primers and planning lessons with the meticulous attention she'd brought to her teaching at Miss Prendergast's. Yet there was a freedom in this frontier classroom that Boston's rigid educational traditions had never permitted. The liberty to adapt curriculum to the practical needs of children who would inherit this developing territory. When James arrived to escort her back to the ranch for supper, she was so engrossed in her work that she didn't hear his approach until his shadow fell across her desk. "The dedicated teacher," he observed with warm amusement. "Should I be jealous of your students already?" Sarah looked up, smiling at the sight of him, snowflakes melting in his dark hair, his tall frame somehow making the schoolroom seem smaller than it had moments before. "They'll only have me during daylight hours," she assured him, gathering her papers. "Evenings and weekends remain firmly reserved for ranch matters." "And for your future husband?" James suggested, helping her into her coat. "Him too," Sarah agreed, color rising in her cheeks at the ease with which they now referenced their upcoming marriage. "Though I expect he'll be quite occupied with winter preparations in the coming weeks." James nodded, his expression turning more serious. "First snowfall is just the beginning. We need to reinforce the north fence before the heavy storms hit, check the livestock shelters, lay in more feed." As they stepped outside into the snowy afternoon, Sarah tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, appreciating anew the solid strength of him. The contrast between them was particularly noticeable today. Sarah bundled in layers that made her appear even smaller, James striding easily through snowdrifts that reached mid-calf on him but nearly to Sarah's knees. "I received a letter from my sister Rebecca today," Sarah mentioned as they made their way toward the waiting wagon. "She's considering a visit in the spring." "All the way from Boston?" James seemed surprised but pleased. "That's quite a journey." "Rebecca has always been the adventurous one," Sarah explained. "While I was practicing penmanship and deportment, she was climbing trees and exploring tide pools. She's been widowed 3 years now, husband lost at sea, and I think she seeks a change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. James helped her into the wagon with careful hands, then climbed up beside her. "She'd be welcome at the ranch for as long as she wishes to stay. Might do her good to see the territory." The simple acceptance of her family, sight unseen, touched Sarah deeply. It represented yet another difference between James and Herbert. Crawford had always spoken of tolerating family visits once they were married, as if her connections were burdens to be endured rather than relationships to be honored. The ride to McKinnon Ranch passed in comfortable conversation about the upcoming school opening, the winter preparations, and plans for the Christmas Eve ceremony. As they approached the homestead, however, Sarah noticed an unfamiliar horse tethered outside. "Were you expecting visitors?" she asked, noting James's sudden alertness. "No," he replied, his body tensing slightly as he scanned the property with careful eyes. The mystery resolved itself as they pulled into the yard. Tommy Wilson emerged from the barn, accompanied by a well-dressed gentleman whose city attire looked jarringly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the ranch. "Mr. McKinnon," Tommy called, waving them over. "This here's Mr. Crawford from Clearwater. Says he needs to speak with Miss Fleming." Sarah's heart stuttered painfully. Crawford. Not Herbert himself, surely. He would still be in California. But perhaps a relative? She hadn't considered that Herbert's family might have connections in Wyoming territory. The stranger approached as James helped Sarah down from the wagon. He was older, perhaps 60, with the prosperous look of a successful businessman, and the confident bearing of one accustomed to authority. "Miss Fleming," he greeted her with a formal bow. "Mayor Josiah Crawford. I believe you were acquainted with my son Herbert." Mayor Crawford, Herbert's father. The connection hit Sarah with unexpected force. The telegram that had shattered her. Future had mentioned family objections, but she'd assumed it came primarily from Herbert's mother and sisters. "Mayor Crawford," she acknowledged, proud of how steady she kept her voice. "This is unexpected." James positioned himself subtly at her side, not hovering but present, a silent statement of support that Sarah appreciated more than words could express. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," Crawford said, his gaze taking in both Sarah and James with shrewd assessment. "Business brought me to Clearwater, but when I heard your name mentioned at Thompson's store, I felt compelled to seek you out." "I see," Sarah replied neutrally. "How may I help you, Mayor Crawford?" The older man glanced at James, then at Tommy, who still hovered nearby with undisguised curiosity. "Perhaps we might speak privately. Family matters, you understand." James's expression hardened slightly, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's all right," she assured him. "Mayor Crawford and I can speak in the parlor." "I'll see to the horses," James said after a moment's hesitation. The look he gave Crawford contained a clear warning before he moved away, taking Tommy with him. Inside the ranch house, Sarah directed Crawford to the parlor, a simple room that she had gradually transformed with feminine touches over the past. Weeks, dried wildflowers arranged in pottery vases, curtains sewn from fabric purchased at Thompson's store, a colorful cushion on the rocking chair where she spent evenings reading while James worked on accounts. "You seem settled here," Crawford observed, taking in these details with obvious surprise. "Quite a change from Boston." "Yes," Sarah agreed simply, remaining standing rather than inviting him to sit. She had no intention of prolonging this unexpected encounter. "What brings you to Wyoming territory, Mayor Crawford?" The older man sighed, removing his hat to reveal thinning gray hair. "Several matters, Miss Fleming. Railroad interests primarily, but finding you here was unexpected. As was receiving your son's telegram in Chicago," Sarah countered, her voice cooler than the snow outside. "After I'd traveled halfway across the country to meet him, Crawford had the grace to look uncomfortable. Yes, about that. Herbert's decision was perhaps hastily made." "Hastily made?" Sarah repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. "He abandoned me, sir. Left me stranded in a territory where I knew no one, with limited funds and nowhere to go." "And yet you appear to have landed on your feet," Crawford observed, gesturing to encompass the ranch house. "Quite resourcefully, I might add." The implication that she had quickly secured another arrangement stoked a flare of indignation in Sarah's chest. "If you've come to inquire about my welfare, you can see it's quite satisfactory. If you've come for some other reason, I suggest you state it plainly." Crawford studied her with new respect, clearly reassessing the quiet schoolteacher. He or his son had dismissed as too inconsequential to merit basic courtesy. "Herbert has had second thoughts," he finally said. "Upon reaching California, he found the opportunities less promising than anticipated. He's returning east next month and asked me to assess the situation should I encounter you in my travels." Sarah stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Assess the situation," she finally managed. "Do you mean to determine if I'm still available to him?" "Bluntly put, but yes," Crawford admitted. "He realizes now that family concerns about compatibility were perhaps overstated." The audacity of it, the sheer presumption that she would be waiting, grateful for reconsideration, struck Sarah as so absurd that a laugh escaped her before. She could contain it. "Mayor Crawford," she said when she'd regained her composure, "your son rejected me because I was too short to compliment his height properly. He did so after I'd traveled 2,000 miles to become his wife. He didn't even have the courage to tell me himself. She straightened to her full 5'1", chin lifted. Now you come here, to the home of the man I'm going to marry, to assess whether I might still be available to Herbert. The answer is no. Emphatically, permanently no. Crawford's expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and finally, resignation. I see. Well, that's clear enough. He replaced his hat, preparing to depart. For what it's worth, Miss Fleming, I opposed Herbert's decision. I thought it short-sighted. The unintentional pun hung in the air between them. Sarah merely raised an eyebrow, unwilling to make this easier for him. Though I must say, Crawford continued, glancing around the comfortable parlor once more, it appears the whole affair has worked out rather fortuitously for you. McKinnon is a respected rancher, if somewhat unconventional, more suitable to a frontier life than my son would have been. It was as close to an apology as she was likely to get from this proud man. Sarah decided to accept it with grace rather than bitterness. Yes, she agreed simply. Things have indeed worked out as they should. She escorted Crawford to the door, where James was waiting, his tall frame outlined against the snowy landscape beyond. The contrast between the two men could not have been more striking. Crawford with his city clothes and calculating demeanor, James with his rugged authenticity and unwavering presence. McKinnon, Crawford acknowledged with a businessman's nod. You have a fine property here and a remarkable fiancé. I'm aware, James replied, his deep voice carrying absolute certainty. On both counts. After Crawford had departed, Sarah stood beside James in the doorway, watching the visitor's horse disappear down the snow-covered road toward town. Are you all right? James asked quietly. Surprisingly, yes, Sarah answered truthfully. A month ago, that encounter would have devastated me. Now it feels like closure. The final page of a book I'm no longer reading. James's arms settled around her shoulders, warm and secure. What did he want? To see if I was available to reconsider. Herbert's offer, Sarah said, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. Apparently, California didn't prove as profitable as expected. James's laugh rumbled through his chest. Man's a fool, just like his son. Their loss is my gain, Sarah said, turning to face him fully. Standing on the porch step gave her a few inches of additional height, though she still had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Or rather, our gain. Snow began falling again, gentle flakes drifting around them in the fading afternoon light. James brushed one from Sarah's cheek with a tenderness that belied his strength. Christmas Eve seems very far away, he murmured. 2 months, Sarah reminded him with a smile. Not so very long in the grand scheme of things. Long enough when you're waiting for something precious, James countered, drawing her gently into the warmth of the house and closing the door on Crawford's retreating figure and all he represented from her past. Inside, the fire crackled in. Welcome, and the simple table was set for their evening meal. Sarah removed her coat and moved naturally to the kitchen, where stew simmered in Mary's cast-iron pot. James watched her from the doorway, his expression holding something that went beyond affection or desire, a profound gratitude that Sarah recognized because she felt it too, gratitude for rejection that had led to acceptance, for loss that had opened the door to finding, for a man too concerned with appearances who had unwittingly directed her to one who saw beneath surfaces to the truth of hearts. "What are you thinking?" James asked, noting her thoughtful expression. As she stirred the stew, Sarah smiled, a full, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. "I'm thinking that being exactly the right height for you is much better than being too short for Herbert Crawford." James crossed the kitchen in 2 long strides and lifted her effortlessly, setting her on the countertop so their eyes were level. The playful gesture brought them face to face, erasing the physical difference between them. "Perfect," he declared, his blue eyes warm with promise. "Exactly perfect." And as his lips met hers in a kiss that held both tenderness and passion, Sarah Fleming, soon to be McKinnon, knew with bone-deep certainty that she had indeed found the place, the purpose, and the person who made her not too short, not too anything but exactly perfectly right. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.